We are asking founders to see the future and bring it today, right? And snowball that success over time so that it's not just the MVP, but the next product, the prototype, the first commercial contracts, first 10 customers, the first 100 customers. All of that needs to be snowballed.
Hey founders, I'm Rahul, a product manager at Block71, and today I'll be having an in-depth conversation with Jeremy Au on why it's important for startups to deploy capital efficiently. Jeremy is a VC and chief of staff at Monksel Ventures, a venture capital firm investing in early-stage tech companies, primarily pre-Series A and Series A in Southeast Asia. He also hosts Brave Southeast Asia Tech, a global top 10 podcast with over 30,000 monthly listeners. Let's talk. Hey Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here.
So I've heard you mention this, that startups should really know their business to deploy capital efficiently. What do you mean by that?
Well, the awkward reality is that startups is really hard, right? We are asking founders to build something that has never been built before. We are asking founders to see the future and bring it today, right? And get it done quickly and efficiently, effectively. And so what that means is that they have to do two things. One is that they have to gain resources that they normally would not have the right to have. So they don't deserve to have, but they do it because they rally the people, the capital, the talent needed to make it happen. But on the other side, they have to deploy effectively, right? Because even if you're able to rally people, if you're not able to manage and lead them to build a product that needs to be done, then you're not going to be a successful founder, right? Because you don't build a product that you rally people towards. Vice versa, there are people who are very good at building something, but they don't have the ability to rally the resources and the capital and the people needed to make it happen. So, when we think about founders, especially successful founders, they have to have both skill sets. They have to be able to rally something out of nothing, but also be able to build something out of nothing. And so being efficient and effective about the capital they've raised and stewarding it well in a way to build out what they've promised to build and snowball that success over time so that it's not just the MVP, but the next product, the prototype, the first commercial contracts, the first 10 customers, the first 100 customers. All of that needs to be snowballed. And so the founders that we admire in the media today are the ones who are able to kind of like not just do it on a one-time basis for either end of it, but make it into a flywheel where the success of rallying resources lets them deploy resources, and the ability to deploy resources well helps them rally more resources. And that's the flywheel that we're looking for in strong founders.
Yeah, I think no startup is ever going to have enough resources to really grow, which is why this becomes very important, right? Like how do you deploy capital? But is capital only for growth, or is there also an angle of like growing, but the priority being also surviving? Not taking unnecessary risks.
It's a bit of oxymoron, right? Because if you're talking about a startup that's raised venture capital, you are underwriting not just a social contract, but also a legal contract to build a startup that's going to do something that hasn't been done before, right?
Yeah.
And so that could be, for example, reinventing the supply chain in Asia, right? All the way to building fusion reactors. So what's happening is that when you go out to the markets, especially capital markets, you make a vision to say, I want to make this technology happen and commercialize it, make it happen. And in exchange, I give you a percentage, right, of the future profits that will happen if this comes true. And so both sides know what the level of risk is. And so your job is to make it happen, right? And the truth is that venture capital has happened before. If you look at the whaling industry hundreds of years ago, it used to be a very risky expedition, right? And so you had these captains who would travel across the world in the ships, and they would have to rally the talent, the harpoons, the ship, the supplies, and they had to navigate for years to basically hunt whales and bring them back. And that's such a risky endeavor. So people are willing to finance that risk. So the truth of the matter is that if you're a startup that has underwritten that contract with a venture capital fund to search for something, well, it's not that you're using this money and suddenly using it to survive. You only got that money because you were asked to grow and experiment, but it is understood by the financier here that there is a high probability of failure. In fact, so the contract that will have the protective provisions. It would price in a way where the financing side understands that a certain percentage of these startups would not succeed, but that's okay. And that's a big difference because, if you go back even just like say, 50 years ago, if you want to set up a startup anywhere, for example, in Asia, you would have to write a personal loan, right? You would be on your own home, you would be on your own personal credit guarantee, right? Collateral that you have to do it. And so the truth of the matter is that you probably wouldn't be able to borrow enough to make it work, and you wouldn't be given enough time to let it play out. And people wouldn't be able to underwrite such a serious risk, right? And so as a result, it was just structurally and financially very difficult for people to create technology-dependent, high-risk ventures. And so this industry didn't exist, venture capital didn't exist. And the only people who could be entrepreneurial were people who were very well off and or very well connected to be able to do so. But now in today's world, it's kind of, amazingly great because now anybody who is, smart, hardworking, and willing to take on that risk, if they're able to see the future, they're able to write a deck, and they're able to propose that idea to somebody who's been professionally trained to review and vet and say, look, we're happy to give you funding that is not a credit, guarantee on your house or your life or your future. Is that if you succeed, 20% of the company's profits will go to the investor. And if it fails, it's okay, right? We underwrite the risk. So think about it, right? So as a result, what that means is that startups have already written that social contract, but it also is well understood. The only reason why they're able to get the capital is because they're going to experiment and grow. So startups should be focused on being very clear about what they're going to use that capital for and trying their best to succeed and maximizing for the chance of success with the knowledge that if it fails, then there's a gentleman's agreement that it's okay. But the question is, how do you also be able to succeed and maximize the chance of success, but also that if you do fail, to fail gracefully?
Yeah. So when startups do raise capital, what is the sort of responsibility that the founders and startups have, to the investors?
I think there's two parts of it, right? I think there's the legal and fiduciary responsibility. And then the second, of course, is very much what was the agreement in terms of the business and commercial side. So I think the legal responsibilities are relatively straightforward, right? Which is that if we have underwritten to invest a certain amount of capital with you, then you are at minimum required to have a fiduciary duty to it, which means, don't use it for personal expenditures, focus on the business, don't do anything illegal or unethical with that capital, right? The second aspect is the commercial aspect, which is that there's an understanding to say like, hey, after reviewing the financials, after reviewing the business plan, the investor who should also have a fiduciary duty to their limited partners as well is undertaking to say that we believe that there's a strong possibility of success. So the question is, how do you build that company that both folks have agreed to try to build? No business plan is perfect. And so the truth of the matter is that the business plan that is being proposed obviously has a vision of becoming a very large outcome. But the truth is that it's an experiment with many different milestones from a plan perspective. But from a learning perspective, I actually gated experiments, right? And so, for example, would be like, we believe, nuclear fusion is one of those moonshot technologies that are being built today. So people are trying to say, we believe that, first of all, with millions of dollars, we can actually build a prototype fusion reactor, right? And then two is, we believe that we're able to get more energy out of the energy we put in as the next step. And then we're going to do that for like 1 second, right? And then after that, of course, then the question is, can you do it for 1 minute, 1 hour, and scale that out? And then eventually you say like, okay, I run this for like a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And after that, can I then scale it out? Can I commercialize it? Which is also slightly different, right? Scaling it out means I can build multiple reactors from a science and production basis. And then after that, it's commercialized basis, which is we believe that we can have demand and people will buy it, right? So think about it as one of those deep tech startups where you have an R&D component, you have a teaming and build out component. After that, you have a production and scale up component, and after that you have commercialization component. So all of these are very different phases. You could say that obviously in a Gantt chart, they're overlapping and they're all gated. But of course, there are different learnings, right? So for example, like if you're trying to make a decision about how to commercialize it, you may have a thesis, okay, we want to sell it to people in Southeast Asia, for example. But it turns out maybe you would do like the commercialization and you're like, it turns out it's people in the Middle East who want it or people in America. So these are different learnings that we have. And so the tricky part that we have is that, there is a finite amount of resources and therefore time. So, we just talked about it. If you're being funded $10 million, so you and I, wow, this sounds like an amazing amount of money, right? $10 million on a personal basis. You can put it in bonds. You probably don't have to work for the rest of your life. And then, you can be financially independent and retire early, right? But $10 million to build up a nuclear fusion startup is kind of like a drop in the bucket because, it's so expensive. The talent that you need, the engineering, the tolerances that need to be built out. So what I'm trying to say here is that as a result, the financial resources goes to, people, hardware, so forth, but therefore it represents a certain amount of time. And that time represents a finite amount of constraints in which the experiments need to go as fast as possible. So what we should be thinking about is like, right now you and I are sitting down and we're saying, okay, here's a business plan to get nuclear fusion that's commercially viable, and thousands of these nuclear fusion reactors are being built across the board, right? The truth is, if you can do that $10 million to create $1 billion outcome, there's a tremendous outcome because there's 100 times outcome, right? But let's just say you need to raise $1 billion to create $1 billion of revenue. Then, you're taking $1 and you're producing $1 of outcome, right? We all have finite resources, finite time, finite talent, finite energy. And so fundamentally, what's happening is that venture capital is structuring a finite amount of resources for a known amount of risk. And as the founder, how do you shepherd those resources and accelerate that pace of learning, that pace of experimentation, that pace of deployment, so that the whole business plan is executed as cheaply as possible, as efficiently as possible, in as little risk as possible, right? And that's kind of like the tricky part, because the best founders will do that, as a result create 100x, 1000x outcomes, because they're able to take $1 and generate $1,000 worth equivalent, right? Take $10 million and generate $1 billion worth of outcome, versus the converse, which is that you're not efficient, you're not effective. And so the truth is there are companies that are reputable who have taken billions of dollars capital and generated $0 of outcome, right? So these are kind of like the dynamics that I think the world has to be thoughtful about.
Yeah, I think one perfect example is Twitch. I think they just raised $7 to $10 million and created the live streaming service when Netflix, a corporate company, spent around $80 to $100 million. So it was 10x cheaper.
Yeah, and I think there's so many examples of that, right? If you look at Lyft versus Uber, both of them have generated different enterprise values, but also both of them raise different quantums of capital as well, right? And so it turns out that Lyft has about comparable capital efficiency as Uber. But what's interesting is that Airbnb, is better than both of them, right? They've raised and generated a better outcome and been way more capital efficient in terms of the outcomes they've generated. And so I think it's really interesting to see, because it's a function, of course, of the right founder, the right team, the right product market fit.
Yeah. And in 2023, this is definitely the sort of mindset that you would want to have, right? Like capital efficiency. And I think I just read about David Sachs, he has this ratio called burn multiple, which is basically like a ratio of like when you, for every increase in burn, what is the increase in ARR?
Yeah.
And ideally the ratio should be, like you said, less than 1, because you wouldn't want to raise $1 billion and generate $1 billion. And
well, I mean, it's not the worst outcome to do if you think about it. I mean, if someone, wrote you $100 million and wanted you to generate $50 million of revenue and everybody agreed upon it, then it's fair, right? We have people who are not financially minded, right? So maybe there's a saying like, we want to create a viable business and something that's, for example, ESG centric. So it's okay for us to lose money because we want to believe that there are social benefits, right, to this enterprise. So, the truth of the matter is that, you mentioned something which was about capital efficiency, and now it's important to be capital efficient. a bear market, it's always important to be capital efficient because, if you are a founder and let's say you're capital efficient in bear market, then you survive and you still have a profitable outcome and you still make money. And in a bull market, if you are capital efficient, then you have a bigger outcome for yourself. Exactly. And so you make even more money for the same amount of work. But I think what happens is that when we're in a bull market, what we're kind of saying is that when the market's too hot, what it means is that the thresholds, the hurdle rate for capital becomes lower. And so the opportunity cost of capital becomes lower. And so as a result, people are more willing to take on more risk for the same amount of capital being deployed. And so what that means is that startups that were in a gray zone that, were not slam dunks in terms of being able to do that, they were increasingly underwritten during the zero interest rate policy era that's behind us today. And that's okay. It's just a function of the macro fundamentals of it. I think there's a lot of well-meaning teams that try their best and they failed. But I think people have to remember that startups are meant to fail. Over 90% of startups will not make it. And so I think one of the interesting things about Southeast Asia is that I think now that we're finally going to our first ever bear market ever, we're suddenly discovering that failure is a default case. So what's really important is that if you believe and understand that failure is the default case, then it makes the ecosystem wake up, which is that founders kind of sit down and say, look, am I serious about being a founder? Because failure is the default scenario. So how do I put myself through the Olympic level kind of athlete training, right? To have the maximum amounts of success to be actually successful, right? And so I think that makes founders much more sober, much more willing to look past the glitz and the media glamour and just be like, okay, actually it is a hard job. So that's one side. And then on the other side, I think we have a venture capital side, which is understand, okay, we understand that the risk of failure is higher than we thought it was going to be. And so we have a responsibility, a professional responsibility to have a higher bar, right? To be more selective in the teams that we underwrite and also to be more helpful to the teams and be more helpful than you would have to, because if you believe that's 50-50, then you wouldn't be as helpful, right? And I think for the rest of the ecosystem, for the people who are writing the press, the articles, the headlines, the people who are reading the headlines, the people who are like, observing and commentating, I think then these folks will start to say like, hey, okay, we respect graceful failure, right? We respect the teams that try their best. Turns out it doesn't work. So be it that we underwrite, because that was and then everybody becomes more sober and less reactive to be like, oh, you failed, boo. Like, I mean, if we all knew it was hard in the first place, think about it, right? Like, if you said like, hey, I want to be the first Singaporean to be the Olympics, I don't know, shot put, and then everyone will be like, yeah, it's hard, and then if you don't make it, you just become, ASEAN number one. We will tell you like, wow, that was really good. Congratulations. We'll still tell you, we respect you for trying to be an Olympics athlete and you did not get there. And that's too bad, but you got somewhere, right? If your aspiration is to be an Olympics athlete, we understand it to be hard.
Really hard.
And we respect you for it because it's hard.
Yeah.
Right? And I think we kind of forget that for founders, it's really hard. And so but the thing is, that's why we respect founders in the first place. And so when they fail, we should be supportive of them and say, wow, you try your best, right? And so I think that's really the key thing is, I think, we need to move past this glitz to be like, oh, being a founder is awesome.
Yeah, it's so true. And like, you still don't associate when you fail as like such a great effort. It's still shame.
I mean, it's understandable, right? Because at the end of the day, we want to hang out with winners. And, someone who fails looks like a loser, right? And so I think it's human psychology that because people want to be with winners, that people don't want to be with losers. And so I think that's the crux of it, is that I think the best founders want to do it because they care about the business, they care about building. And as a result, I think what you notice is that the best founders, it's not that they don't care about what society thinks, because no human No biological human being wants the social disapproval. Social disapproval is painful. But the question is, do you believe there's something that's higher than a social disapproval? That is deeper, that is more lasting, right? And the truth is, we know that happens all the time. If you look at soldiers, it's not an easy life. You look at activists, you look at police people, you look at firefighters, you look at doctors, you look at nurses. These are all jobs that are not easy, and that, there is a lot of risk associated with the jobs. But yet, if you interview and you survey them and you ask them, they find their job has purpose, they find their job has meaning, and they are unhappy. And I think that's the best thing about humans, is that we don't only have the will to pleasure for hedonic. Obviously, approval is good, disapproval is bad. Everybody obviously has that. But people also have a will to power, to gaining influence, to gaining responsibility, to be able to effect change in their own life and the lives of others. But people also have a will to meaning, right? For a deeper sense of purpose. And so I think the best founders have to say, like, hey, I'm moving past social pleasure / disapproval to say, I care about building out my responsibility and my ability to change the world, but also building out my own sense of purpose because I want to build this.
Otherwise, you would most likely not succeed.
Yeah. When I was a kid, I really wanted, had this dream of being, climbing Mount Everest, right? And so for so many years after that, I timed and so forth. Turns out, I was nowhere closer to climbing Mount Everest. And I was thinking to myself, like, okay, why is it that, I blame myself. Like, Jeremy, you said and told people that on your bucket list, you want to climb Mount Everest. And so you should climb Mount Everest because it's an amazing thing to do. That's what high achievers do. They climb Mount Everest. And at some point of time, I kind of realized, you know what? I don't like the cold. Secondly, I'm an extrovert. I like talking to people. Thirdly, I don't really like the heights, right? So, I'm not like a person who's like, I don't mind going to the hill or whatever it is, but I'm not like someone who's like, loves the heights. So it turns out I don't like the micro activity of climbing a mountain, right? And so as a result, I thought about this. Like, you know what? Climbing Mount Everest is a bad dream. I'm never going to succeed because I don't like the micro activity of climbing, high altitude climbing. But it turns out that I really enjoy hiking. So I love being in nature. It's warm. I get to talk with a few good friends, one or two. And so for myself, I've completed so many beautiful hikes, right? I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail from Los Angeles to Yosemite across 1 month. It was easy for me because I like the micro activity of that. And I think that's a part of it is that, because of being a founder is a hard job. Yeah, awkward reality is that, it's not that you like being a founder or not, but you care about what you're trying to build so much that you find it enjoyable and just keep going, right? And you do it and you do it. And so I think that's really the crux of it for every founder is being thoughtful about that process. And again, it's not the fact that we're not trying to say that you have to hate your job, but it's just saying like, you have to care about something enough to keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, another thing that you mentioned briefly was not to use the capital raise for your personal expenses. So what would be those some scenarios or some expenses which might be not the right thing to do in the best interest of business?
I think it's pretty straightforward because, you are the person being underwritten, take on this responsibility, right? So we mentioned the whaling expedition. Of course, the captain should have food, gets a cabin, has a ship. So the reality is that just as the financier would have underwritten those responsibility provisions for the captain, similarly, right? The VC has underwritten a certain amount of capital to fund your startup for the next 2 to 3 years. And so there's an understood salary that you'll be taking. And the truth of the matter is that the salary will be enough to cover your fundamental life for you to be at your productivity level that you need to be for the company. And so that's how you should think about it. But it would definitely not be the same as that of an employee job somewhere else, right? And so, but the opportunity risk cost of that foregone capital that you could have with another job, that is what's converting into your equity, right? So now we're saying this is you have a lower base, but in compensation for that, you're given the probability adjusted chance of a large ownership share of future profits. So that's actually kind of like the triangle that we're thinking about, right? Which is one triangle is the base that you have, salary that you have, and the other angle that you have is the guaranteed ownership percentage of the future profits they have. So maybe you have 80% of the company, 60% of the company, 50% of the company, 40% of the company, whatever that's left after the equity round. And that represents, obviously, the share of future profits that you have. But the third part of the triangle that you don't understand is the risk, right? Because there's risk associated. Because if you're building a startup today, it'll be just mentioned earlier, right? It's just like the vast majority of startups failed, right? So in the US, the data that we have is that out of 40 seed funded startups, so you already achieve a certain threshold of funding, only 1 out of 40 will become $1 billion outcome, right? But startups is not gambling, right? Because there's no cost, you're not losing money to build a startup. You're going to build it in a domain that you really enjoy. There's no personal cost to it. And you have control, right? As the founder, you have control about maximizing the chances of your company, right? So you're directly responsible for that fate, right? Again, we're just saying that it's very, very hard, right? Yeah. So again, all you're saying is, can you imagine what you say is like, what's the chances of you being an Olympic athlete if you're a Singapore athlete? I'm your example. Let's just say 1 in 40, 1 in 50. Well, you wouldn't go to the Singapore athlete and say like, oh, you trying to become an Olympic athlete is like being like roulette or gambling. Yeah. Well, true from a macro perspective, what we're saying is 1 out of 40 or 1 out of 50 athletes who from Singapore, top performers who become Olympic medalists. But from an individual basis, we know that there's so much in this in their personal control, right? And so I think that's what we should be thinking about is that, at the end of the day, the compensation is that triangle, which is the risk adjustment, the base salary, as well as the equity slice of future profits that the founder gets.
Yeah. And before a startup raise capital, they are often operating under constraints, heavy constraints in terms of resources. But the minute capital comes in, then your tendency, it's a natural tendency, right, to kind of overspend across different activities like hiring and operations and things like that. So what do you think about spending on like operations or hiring, the mistakes that startups could make immediately after fundraising?
Yeah, I think the tricky part is that, again, startups are hard, right? And so when you raise, starting, let's say, millions of dollars of capital, it's a sum that requires very thoughtful consideration about how to deploy. These are the 20 improvements we can do to this company, right? And we're going to stack rank them by how much to increase our revenue and therefore our profitability, and also versus how much cost it would take in terms of time or attention or energy or money to make it happen, right? Changing product market fit, improving our marketing copy for better conversion ratios. Like these are the different aspects, I think, that the founders thinking through. Founders are asked to do everything, right? Because the founder will do everything, the founding team and the founders would have to build everything from scratch and basically build the rocket from liftoff, right? And so I think what at the early stages is really figure out the product market fit and figure out something that people actually want to buy and pay for is the hardest part. And I think what we normally see is that one of the common causes of failure down the road is that they fail to scale up well. So they figure out the product. And so I think when teams fail in the early stages, I think most people kind of understand it's pretty straightforward. It's like you're a company, people don't really want to buy. It's understood. But I think, in today's world, I think a lot of the public failures that we see are because executives didn't really understand what's going on. They didn't understand what was the financial responsibilities. The company went sideways, and so the company had to shut down, right? That's an interesting dynamic, which is, a function, of the personal growth of the leadership team. And so what that means is that there could be all kinds of different reasons, right? So a classic one would be like, CEOs who didn't understand how the financial accounting of it. So they lost track of the financial unit economics of business. This company is scaling, they have money, so they're very focused on growing very quickly. And then they lose track of what the fundamental unit economics of business is, which is that, if you sell one product, you get some profit back as well. And that could be a function of all kinds of different reasons. Maybe you're not paying attention, maybe because you feel like the board wants me to focus on growth rather than profitability. It could be a function of not having the right financial leadership or controller or accountants in place to help you get those numbers in place. So those are the aspects that I think a good CEO is supposed to kind of like be able to look around the corner and see what's coming and build the team accordingly. And so that's the tricky part, is that there's a fundamental transition between the founder to the CEO role. So the founder, again, is somebody who comes up with an idea, gets it off the scratch and makes it work. And then eventually they have that team management, that CEO responsibility, where they have to become, in that sense, someone who's able to allocate resources effectively and gather resources and be able to prioritize accordingly. And I think there's that dynamic as a result. So what I'm trying to say here is, like, from the outside, it looks like they failed because their books were in disorder. But then if you look a little bit deeper, it's like, the books were in disorder because they didn't have the right financial leadership. But the reason why they didn't have financial leadership is because the founder didn't become a successful CEO and see that this was something that was avoidable. I think that's the crux of it, is like, from the outside in, these are the way things fail. And so, like you mentioned, because they don't have enough legal oversight and so forth. But then if you think about it, then it boils down to not having the right people, which boils down to not the right executive decision making by the founding team. So I think that's the crux of it, is being thoughtful about why something happens. And so I think a people aspect of it is really key. So what that means, therefore, is that when someone says that, oh, like you said, there's financial mismanagement, for example, or that was the immediate cause of death, but that was not the underlying root cause of why it happened, right? And so I think in that case, for example, would be not enough financial leadership, which is not enough fundamental executive prioritization on leadership, right? To make that priority. So I think we just have to be thoughtful about that.
Yeah. And you mentioned board. So when investors come onto the cap table, ideally they should be helping the startup go in the right direction. So, but there might be scenarios where that the product needs to go in a certain direction, but then investor has a different opinion based on maybe what the competitor is doing, or what is the trending thing to do right now.
Yes.
So how do you manage things like that?
Yeah, the best way to manage it is have a time machine, right? And figure out who's right down the road. So, if you have a time machine, or you can look at the multiverse of responsibilities, we know that there are good paths and there are worse paths to take, right? So decisions are clear, right, about what's a better decision, what's a worse decision. And I think the way that we often look at it today is like, today we see successful companies that have been founded. We look at Nike, right? Founded by, Shoe Dog, the story of that. We see Uniqlo, we see Mitsubishi, you see Honda. We see all these successful enterprises, right? And so we look back in time and we say, like, okay, these are the chain of decisions they made that were successful. Some that were good, some that were bad, but net, they survived and they became successful. So we know, looking back in time, which decisions were better, which decisions were worse. When the board and the founder is working together, the best case scenario is that you have a high performing founder and your high performing board working together hand in hand, and then together they figure out what the best path is. So that would be the dream scenario to have, right? And they always call it the dream team, right? So I think, in the best boards and the best teams that we've seen, I think you really see that, they're working hand in hand and they're performing well. So what that means is that the board and the founders are busy thinking through the future together, being thoughtful, helping each other, being honest with one another about the future, and having difficult conversations about what the best path is. And so I think the best stories of the best founders and founders who really like the boards is they will say something like, yeah, we disagreed, but in our disagreement, the process of that disagreement helped us understand where we're both coming from, or more importantly, helped us iron sharpen iron, become better as a team and make the right decision at the end of the day.
Yeah.
because it's okay for boards and founders to disagree. Because the truth of the matter is that, again, building the future is hard, especially doing that with constrained, finite resources against competitors. It is hard. And so the truth was, if it was easy, then the founder doesn't need a board. He doesn't need venture capital. He doesn't need funding. Then just do it yourself, right? It was super easy. The truth is, it's hard to build. And so you need that disagreement. You need that dynamic where everyone's disagreeing, but then the disagreement creates a better product. Of course, the awkward reality is there are bad boards and there are bad founders, right? And so, for example, in stories, Theranos, the board, unfortunately, did not have many medical experts. But for the people who were on the board, they could exercise their fiduciary duty better to have had a stronger sense of the fundamental economics and the science behind the Theranos situation to make it better, right? And so the board in that situation, people wish they could have stepped up more, right? Similarly, for FTX, SBF used to call FTX, the board, he used to call it the DocuSign board, in the sense that he would just send them documents and then they'll just DocuSign it automatically. So he obviously didn't see them as an independent board that was acting, and the board members also did not see themselves as having a responsibility. And so because of that, they didn't call the founder to a higher standard, right? And I think I always say, like, imagine if the board of FTX had stepped up earlier. Same thing for Theranos. It would have been painful, but it would have been painful earlier. And so, less capital would have been lost at minimum, but also I think more lives would have been saved, right? More jobs, for the companies could have been protected, right? And so in that scenario, I think people wish that the board had stepped up more. So what I'm trying to say here is that worst case scenario, bad founder, bad board, probably not going to happen, right? You have a great board, great founder, then yeah, there's disagreements. So the tricky now part is that if you're a founder with a board that's not performing very well, or if you're part of a strong board but the founder's not performing very well. So the question is, in those two quadrants, I think people will want to try to move as much as possible towards that top right quadrant, right? So, for example, a board that's with an underperforming founder may choose to step up early and structure a performance review or tell the founder, say, hey, these are parts that we disagree with respectfully. How do we improve this? Can we do this strategically? And not let things go to a board vote, kind of like final conflict, because that's a really bad scenario to be in. Or vice versa, is that if the founder feels that the board is not performing well, to have that conversation early and ask the board to step up. So these are all different aspects that we want to kind of get to that top right quadrant where there's a strong board with a strong founder performing well, disagreeing, but generating a better outcome because of it.
Yeah. But generally, founders don't trust the board. So is that because, there are more bad boards than bad founders? Or like, how important is that the trust between the board and the founder in this equation?
It's super key. And I think the crux of it is that you as a founder should trust the board, because in many ways you selected the board. So when you go out fundraising capital from different folks, the truth of the matter is there are good allocators of capital, and there are better allocators of capital, right? And so you get to choose, right? Because you get a fundraise, and then your job is to structure an auction of capital so that everybody is lining up and there are multiple people fighting to be providing you the capital and multiple people fighting to, as a result, represent you on the board. Because it makes sense, like they're providing capital, they should have the control rights to be able to protect their investment in the company, because they're giving you $5 million, $10 million, $100 million. They should have some of the control rights to be able to protect the capital, right? So you as a founder are saying, like, okay, you put money in me, you're trusting me to build this, and you have rights to protect that capital, and you get to be on a board. Okay, so that's the transactional side of it. The relational side of it is the board is the responsibility, has a fiduciary duty to make sure the whole company succeeds. And so you should really be building a board that you respect. And I think that's what a lot of founders kind of like underweight. And so they're very much focused like, okay, I'm just looking for capital. I'm just looking for, the the cheapest form of capital, and they end up constructing a board they don't respect because they're taking the cheapest form of capital. But the truth of the matter is that, let's be super real, if that board member is highly respectable and high demand by founders, guess what? The capital will be more expensive as a result, right? Because they have a high standing, right? And so in many ways, yes, you're letting a board member invest in you, but in many ways, you're also buying somebody investment. So I always tell people, when the founder is working on the board, I always tell them, like, would you hire this person to be on your board? Because you spend so much time hiring for the best interns, the best junior salespeople, the best executive, the best COO, and you want somebody who's what? Somebody who understands your business, somebody who's competent, and somebody that you can work with. Those will be the minimum requirements that you have to search for somebody to hire as a company. Now, you are hiring for the board. You would also want those things. You will want somebody who's competent, somebody that you trust, and somebody who is working hard to understand your business for the future of this company, right? So you would want, in fact, you probably should have a higher bar.
Yeah, they say
right?
It's like a marriage where you can't get divorced.
Exactly, right? You should have a higher bar because if it's a COO, you can fire your COO because that person's an employee of the company. But somebody who's on your board, who is in many ways managing the future, supervising the future, you can't fire somebody from the board, right? Easily because of that, right? And so you would want to work extra hard, right? And so many founders I know end up just, it's like, we just want to get capital and so forth. And then they end up with a board that they don't like because they either don't respect the person, they don't feel like the person's paying attention, or they just don't trust the person. And when they have that, then guess what? They have constructed the board that they don't like. And then everything else kind of goes downhill from there because they're just managing in spite of the board. And so they're not working well with the board. And those stories will always have friction. And you still get a success story at the end of the day. But it's not an easy path because in the best case scenario, it's a very hard journey. And in a 90% chance of the scenario, the company's going to fail. So imagine, I'm just saying, like, you're going to work your tail off for 10 years to create a $1 billion company. You're going to go through multiple near-death experiences. So you have to work with this board hand in hand on the most important strategic decisions under there. You better be a team you don't like. And 90% chance the company's going to fail and not get there. In which case, I think it's even more important that you have somebody on the board who also cares about you and is giving you the best chance, right? Because the worst case scenario is like 90% chance of failure, but you're somebody you don't like. It's even worse, right? And so I think there's really something that's undervalued, I would say, by founders who are not being thoughtful about what it means to fundraise, but also to help, therefore, hire the board that they want to be part of.
Yeah. Based on the amount you raise, would you change your approach in deploying capital?
As a founder?
Yes.
Well, I think every startup kind of goes through 3 different phases, right? And I think Jeff Basking, which is a Harvard MBA professor, described it as jungle, the dirt road, and highway, right? In the jungle stage, they are lost. It's just the founder, the 2 co-founders, and they're trying to figure out where to go. Where is north? What direction they should go? So they're trying to figure out what product to build, who the ideal customer is, what they need to do, right? So they're trying how to survive. So that's the jungle phase. And the second phase of it is the dirt road, right? So, they roughly know what the product is. They roughly know what they need to do. There's a small team that's there at this point of time. So there's a dirt road aspect of it. And then there's a highway aspect of it, which is, exactly what your product is, what your go-to-market motion is, what your sales and marketing cycle is. So your job is to make it a highway and drive as many trucks as possible to drive a high volume of traffic, right, in that direction. And so those are 3 stages of startups: the jungle, the dirt road, and the highway. And so capital that you raise at each stage in the jungle is underwriting you to explore the jungle and figure out where to go. And the stage of the third road is underwriting you to figure out to do your market entry to a new geography market. Is underwriting you to launch a new product feature or even a new product line, right? And then at the growth stage, at the highway stage, which is your Series C, Series D, Series E, then you're very much being underwritten to expand as fast as possible and launch 5, 10, 20 new geographies to expand from 10% market share to 70% market share. So those are really the three phases that we should be thoughtful about.
Yeah, so the jungle is basically pre-seed and seed.
Yeah.
The dirt road is maybe A and B, and then
Yep.
C and above is the highway.
Yeah, and I think that generally corresponds as well from the VC's perspective what they're looking for, right? Because the pre-seed and seed, they're looking for a great founder who has great thesis, and so they're underwriting that risk. When you have a Series A, generally, you're underwriting people who have already achieved product market fit, maybe $1 million revenue, looking to scale that out to $5 million, $10 million. And then, if you're Series C, D, E, you're already making maybe about $10 million revenue, and now you're scaling that in a very predictable playbook way to $100 million revenue to $1 billion of revenue.
Yeah. So let's say you're raising a seed round. You're essentially looking at like maybe 18 to 24 months of runway to do a bunch of experiments to create a product and test something, right? But I've talked to founders, not now, but maybe a couple of years back. They said that they raised maybe a higher amount because they could. So when you do something like that, does it change the way you approach, how you allocate that capital?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting dynamic because, when the markets are, with a zero interest rate policy, that means that the opportunity cost of capital is low. So the hurdle rate is low, which means that on average, people who raise a certain amount of quantum would be allowed to raise a higher quantum of capital. And companies that may not have passed that threshold, a hurdle rate in the past, now are able to raise some capital. So the result during a bear fundraising market, the hurdle rate is high. So there's a high death rate because there's very little capital available for deployment. So everybody's forced to go to capital efficiency mode, right? But I think the tricky part, and I think the part to remember, is that when the bull market is happening, where it's easy to raise capital, I think if a founder said to me, hey, there's an opportunity to raise more capital because I can, the market's soft, I'm able to raise more capital, I would actually say, that's a good idea. I'll say, yeah, if you're allowed to raise more capital, why not? Because what you're saying is that I'm allowed to, instead of getting $10 million of resources, I'm now allowed to get $20 million of resources. So from my point of view is, if you're allowed to take more, take more resources, right? But the trick here is that you take more resources, but you are just as capital efficient. So if you have raised $10 million, you have been forced to have been a certain level of capital efficiency. So if you now have $20 million, how do you still have that same mindset to be as capital efficient as you did with $10 million? And you still have $10 million in the bank, right? For a backup, for buffer, maybe to deploy that in tier 2 initiatives that are maybe less incrementally good as tier 1 initiatives, but still have a positive ROI. So maybe the tier 1 initiatives give you $5 for every dollar you put in. Maybe at tier 2, maybe they're only giving you $2 for every dollar you put in, right? But it's still a positive outcome, right? And so what I'm trying to say here is that I have no absolute issue if you say like, oh, I have the opportunity to raise more because I can, the market allows me to. I'll say, yeah, go do it. What I also say is just spend it conservatively, wisely, cunningly, the way you would have if you raise the first quantum.
I think by human nature, that's very hard to do.
By nature, it's hard to do it. So I think VCs who are supposed to give capital understand that and should try not to overfund because it's hard to do, right? But that's the VC's responsibility to make sure they don't overpay, overfund, overfeed, right? So that's the VC's responsibility. But a wise and thoughtful founder should take the opportunity to get more resources for the same amount of work, but be just as thoughtful about deploying it in a way that's capital efficient. But fundamentally, it's basically saying the founders acting in an entrepreneurial way to build the company the best way they understand how to do so.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end. Thank you once again for taking the time to do this. And throughout the conversation, I was thinking about your analogy of crossing the river and then feeling the stones. I think that was really nice. That really is what entrepreneurship, figuring out things is when it
Yeah.
comes to startups.
Yeah. I still remember crossing, um, the Sierras, right? And it's hiking, and it's just like, you have to cross the river, right? And then you take off, you know, your shoes, you take off your socks, you put it in your backpack, right? And you have your hiking poles, right? And you have a plan of attack, and then you just have to be careful, right? And then when you cross that, then you tell your hiking companion, you say, okay, watch out for this, watch out for that, right? And I think that's a responsibility that all people have, is that when we're crossing the river, we have a plan, we cross it um, as best as we can, and then we also tell our pet companions how to do it because you're trying it, right? And I think there's a responsibility for all of us. I think what you're doing, or what I'm doing as a VC, what founders are doing in community groups, and also what I'm doing with the Brave Southeast Asia Tech Podcast, right, which is www.bravesea.com. Point of that podcast is to help us educate one another about it, right? And I think it's a very underappreciated asset and underappreciated resource, is that if you're able to get that learning from somebody else, that saves you time, right? And so I think, we're responsible to one another in this community to give that knowledge as much as we can.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.